Hey, it's Curly, and it's that time again. Festival Collection 2024 is right around the corner, both for Japan and for everyone else overseas. And just like last year's 2023 collection, we have ourselves two new overtriggers. But whether you hate them or hate them, today in this video I wanted to go over what these new overtriggers do and maybe some of the decks that might consider playing them. So first things first, we've got ourselves here the Spiritual King of Night Sky, Nyx Lasezela here, who I'm just going to call the Grape overtrigger. This has, of course, the usual effect of any overtrigger that says whenever this is checked, you give a unit 100 million power, draw one card, and remove this card from the game. However, if you drive check this on your turn, it has an additional effect. This one says that you choose one card from your damage zone, put it into your hand. Then choose up to one unit from your hand, call it to rearguard circle, and that unit gets 10k power to the end of the turn. Sounds pretty good. The next step, we'll go over to the next one here, Spiritual King of Bright Sky, Murderzabilia, who I'm just going to call the Piss overtrigger. So same effect, same generic overtrigger effect, and then the additional effect here is that you can draw up to one card for every two of your opponent's open rearguard circles or guardian circle. Then in addition to that, you retire all of your opponent's rearguards and guardians. So these are two pretty interesting overtriggers. There's been some debate online, similar to how last year we had the debate that the red overtrigger was the clear winner and the blue overtrigger was kind of mediocre, and then that instantly flip-flopped where the blue overtrigger is the one that's played in, I want to say, 80% of decks, whereas the red overtrigger sees play in like some niche builds that it actually benefits in. It seems to, for the most part, that the purple overtrigger is the one that a lot of people think is the one that is way superior, both in its utility and it's just all of its effects, whereas a lot of people, for whatever reason, have compared this to just an upgraded Obara, which is just the basic overtrigger. With that said, let's take a look at what decks might like these new overtriggers. So as usual, here we are on Tier Maker, clearly my favorite site of all time when it comes to this discussion type videos. And what I have here is I have a couple of somewhat self-exclamatory tiers here. So we have ourselves 5 tiers in the middle. We have ourselves where the stuff we're going to talk about is going to go. Then we have ourselves here 2 tiers above that where it says considers the piss or the yellow overtrigger, the light overtrigger, whatever you want to call it. And this one, the top one, is great with that overtrigger. So just something that, you know, it kind of benefits from it essentially, and something that would really like this overtrigger. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have kind of the same deal where if, you know, maybe they want the grape or the purple or the dark overtrigger, or if they really would benefit from this new overtrigger. And what we'll talk about today specifically are all the cards from Divine Set 1 and 2 specifically, and then just some other decks that I cherry-picked just for the sake of talking about them. So we'll start with the stuff from Divines first. We'll just go in order here. So starting off with Triumph Dragon. Triumph Dragon, I guess, could consider the yellow overtrigger. It doesn't really matter too much. I guess it can go either or. The problem here with this grape or purple overtrigger is that healing 1 damage and calling something out to get 10k is pretty much good in just about every situation. Whereas the ability to retire opponent's rearguards is technically also good, but doesn't give you as much value as just adding a card while also healing, while also calling out a unit if you would like. So I'm going to try and focus less on whether or not it's just generally good and whether or not the deck actually would prefer this. So in that case, I would say that maybe Triumph Dragon could consider the yellow overtrigger just because of the fact of how it works, which will come up for a lot of these other decks as we go through this. But essentially, if you're attacking and your opponent decides to guard, you know, you have a big Vanguard swing, they guard with like 5 triggers or whatever the case may be, this will just wipe that all out, so your attack will go through because it retires both Guardians and Rear Guards. So something like Triumph Dragon, if you pump him up really big since he has the crit, if your opponent doesn't PG it, they can, you know, spread a bunch of cards to try and guard it, and then that just gets wiped out and they just take the hit. The reasons why PGs don't work is because when you play a PG, you apply the effect to whatever is being attacked, that until the end of that battle, they cannot be hit. So whether or not the PG gets ripped up, eaten by your opponent, the effect has already been applied at that point, unless it, you have a card on the other side that somehow nullifies it, right? Or just flat out prevents it from being playing, which is something that's going to come up later on. So something like Varga, I think, would possibly really like this overtrigger because it just wiped the field. The wiping the field isn't whatever. Drawing is kind of whatever. It's decent. It'll probably always be able to draw at least one additional card from this. But also, if your opponent constantly tries to guard, try to maybe hard guard your attacks, this will just wipe the field clear of that. So this wouldn't be horrible in Varga. Then we have ourselves Andra here, who mainly focuses on resting the Vanguard to call out 2 cards from the ride deck, one of which can attack from the back row, then putting them back into soul in order to stand the Vanguard, which is a pretty interesting little mechanic. I think this would probably like the purple overtrigger. I don't know if it specifically wants the yellow one per se. It doesn't really care too much about the retire, so you could consider it if anything. Then we got ourselves here Virginia, who likewise I think it could consider. It doesn't really benefit greatly from the retire. It doesn't have a crazy Vanguard swing. Well, that's a bit of a lie actually. It does have a bit of a big Vanguard swing because of the order that it has, that allows it to become a really big Vanguard swing because it gets power for each of their normal units on board in drop. So it can be a really big Vanguard swing. But whether that's guarded normally or not is sort of up to debate, where you could probably argue that this goes here, perhaps just because this can maybe be PG'd because it doesn't hit, it hits pretty decent numbers and it's pretty threatening where cards normally might not be enough. But I would say maybe, yeah, maybe it'll consider blue or purple, I should say. It's kind of hard to tell. Then we got ourselves here the Oslegeist here from Dark States. This doesn't really care either way. It doesn't really care if it retires your opponent's board or if it calls something out. If I had to choose one, it would be the purple one, but I don't think it directly benefits it, so I think we'll do that. We'll keep these two here, just because it in general, yes, this is better, but it doesn't inherently benefit them aside from just the fact that healing and getting a card from damage is good. It can't really do much from that, so we'll leave these here. Like, they can either go either way or just, play whatever they're playing currently. Andal here can actually consider the purple overtrigger just because of the fact that the dolls end up binding themselves, and you can actually draw from one of the dolls. And given the attack pattern, if you were to check this, which is more than likely considering you have triple drive in the deck, you can just go ahead and get an additional extension from that, from something else that you can then bind and get an additional 5k shield with. So yeah, it's actually a pretty decent option here. Whereas like for Bladmire, would really like the yellow overtrigger because of the fact that you can very easily wipe out your opponent's ability to use sentinels. So they have to hard guard your attacks or just take them. If they hard guard them, you just wipe this out, right? They try to hard guard your Bladmire, you just wipe it out, they take 2 crit to the face, and they have to deal with possibly a unit that has a crit as well, with 100 million as well. So I feel like this works really well in Bladmire because of its ability to have a very strong Vanguard swing and also turn off Sentinels. So anything that has, I think, really strong Vanguard swings and obviously turns off Sentinels is going to benefit from this yellow overtrigger. This guy, I don't think either of these care too much from it, to be honest. This one might actually not mind it because he, similar to Raziel, he can call something from drop, but it's just 1 card. And they usually don't play too many cards from hand generally, so they might be able to use this to get an extra 5th attack. Whereas Raziel and Liel probably could go either way. I don't think it insanely benefits them. The Liel Vanguard swing, even though she goes twice, I don't think it's really that massive where like this benefits from it. Next up we have ourselves here Astrum. Astrum could kind of consider the purple one because it does give it an extra but it doesn't insanely benefit it per se. this overtrigger, because this attack is pretty massive, honestly, so you can maybe consider it just because of the fact that it can swing in with a bunch of power on the Vanguard and on the rear guard. So if your opponent tries to hard guard that, you can break through it. But it doesn't have like a crit or anything like that, so I don't know if it really considers it. Welstra here is an interesting one. In general for Brankgate, I should have mentioned it here. They want to use their overtrigger, right? They want to use the Elder Buff. Elder Buff is super strong, but while it might not be the most optimal play, they could maybe consider this overtrigger just because they do have the ability to retire the opponent's field pretty easily, which means they're going to be able to draw a lot of cards from this, which might be good, might not be good. The opponent, if they try to hard guard, is usually going to be pretty difficult for them because of the fact that their Vanguard's power is going to be reduced by a lot. So if you blow out their Guardians as well, might be pretty decent. So you can make maybe a decent case for Welstra playing the yellow overtrigger. Whereas we have everyone else here. Rotovisor stands its own rear, so I don't think it really needs to call something out specifically, and retiring is kind of whatever for it. Cristianos, I don't think this really benefits for him. He usually doesn't have that kind of a hand where he has something to call out and doesn't care too much about the retire. Kind of the same for Veleno here. Kind of the same for Zorga. You kind of want to focus on your Karmas or your Dragons, right? Those are your attackers. You don't necessarily want to overcall them, but they do retire themselves. But that might be until end of turn. But either way, I don't think you have anything really that you want to call out per se, so I don't think that'll specifically benefit it. Marlene is kind of in the same deal. I don't think it directly benefits her. Then we have ourselves here Chris Rain, which is actually pretty interesting. Unfortunately, due to the timing of her Divine skill, what happens is that when you attack, you get your drive checks, then the Divine skill activates, that bounces everything to hand. So unfortunately, it won't work in that way for Chris Rain, where you can like get an extra attack after your board is clear or something like that. But, you could maybe consider the yellow overtrigger, just because this will swing in with a huge Vanguard swing with a crit. You can wipe that out if your opponent tries to guard it. It gives Lyrical the ability to retire, which notoriously they don't have access to. So that's kind of decent. The Flame G girls, maybe they can consider the purple overtrigger, just because of the fact that a lot of their units, their main units, they put themselves on the bottom of the deck or retire themselves, one of the two. So you'll have the empty rearguard circles to use it, so this might let this deck actually extend. It also has 2 Vanguard swings, so it's possible that it'll come up, right? Sienna is here the prime example of a deck that loves this yellow overtrigger, because her effect specifically states that if your opponent has, I believe it's 2 or less rearguards, both in rearguard circles and in the Guardian circle, she gets a drive and a crit. So what happens here? You just wipe everything. She instantly gets a drive and a crit mid-battle, which is kind of sick. And I feel like you want to play into that more often than not. Hazard here is kind of interesting. We skipped Felty, but we'll go back to her. Whoops. Hazard is kind of interesting because of the fact that she can actually put her cards on the bottom of the deck and draw something. So I think she probably would really benefit from the Grape purple overtrigger here, because of the fact that you can very easily do your attacks in a certain way where you'll have the empty rearguard circle, and you might even be able to do something. Well, I don't know when that card triggers. The one that lets them swap from back row. I don't know if you'll be able to like play an extra one and then do that again. But I feel like it'll work out pretty well here just because of how her mechanic works. Then going back to Felty Rosa, I think she would also like the purple overtrigger, because you try to have an open, field, so you can then call out your ghost for her effect. If, the worst thing happens, you just check a bunch of triggers and you don't actually get to call anything. If you check the overtrigger, you are able to then call something from that effect, which would be pretty decent. So I think it wouldn't hurt to have the purple overtrigger specifically in Felty Rosa. Both Magnolia decks are kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because they're in Stoicheia. There's a lot of cards in Stoicheia that allow you to on place call out another card. Because of the way that the purple overtrigger is worded, you call something out from your hand, so it will activate these effects, so something like Eileen or Diantha. Then there's also the fact that Magnolia can attack from the back row with its units, right? Mask if there's a Dragon Tree marker, Elder if you're on Elder. So what you can do with this is that you can extend from this deck's potential 6 attacks to 8 attacks. If you check this and call out your Eileen or your Diantha on, circles that have already, or, you call out Eileen, who then calls something out from drop on circles that have already attacked, you can then extend from that. And it works really well because you can make use of the back row as well in these decks. Whether or not they prefer this over their current overtrigger is up to the players, probably not, but it is a consideration. It's not the worst option. Likewise, I would say Maelstrom can maybe do the same thing, just because it is able to move its rearguard circles around, and it puts its Tear Dragons into Soul, I believe. I don't know if that's on the end of battle or end of turn, but it does have the ability to move its rearguard circles around, so you might be able to finagle something that way. Flagberg is kind of an interesting one because it can kind of go both ways to an extent. Because if you hard guard the Flagberg that has the guard restrict, it'll just blow that away. But also the fact that it can get an extra attack out of it. But I'll leave this in the center here. Little Lazul here doesn't care too much either way. I don't think it does have a decent amount of on-place effects, I think, from its skills, so calling out something from hand won't hurt. So maybe it can consider this, maybe not. It'd probably be fine either way. Silhouette. Yeah, you can probably make an argument for Silhouette to use the purple overtrigger, just because of the fact that you can arm yourself, and then you'll have an open rearguard circle that you can call something out, and then you call one of your arms to another one of those open rearguard circles. So you might be able to work that out, but I'm pretty sure you would still much rather the Elder Buff. Heroes is one that's possibly maybe really good with the purple overtrigger, because they've notoriously not been able to use Elder Breath to its full potential because of the way that its attack pattern works out, whereas now this overtrigger actually benefits their attack pattern, because typically what you'll do is you'll attack with a front row rear guard, assuming Amas has already done her thing. You'll attack with a front row rear guard and attack with maybe either a column that's a booster and an attacker, or not. But you can attack with that column, and then what happens is during the purple overtrigger, you can then overcall on the column that has the booster here, and then use the skill of your Forial to then switch this column here that has 2 presumably grade 2s. So technically you can work it out that way. It does actually benefit from their attack pattern, so it might actually work out. Then we got ourselves here Luan, who does have a bunch of drive checks. And can actually put those drive checks back into the deck. The overtrigger, of course, will get removed, so you can't just cycle it. But I think this might actually like this overtrigger over the blue one, just because the chance to heal is pretty high, because this deck has 5 drive checks on Persona Rive, 4 normally. So the chance to be able to add something from the damage zone is pretty good, especially because this is slightly piece reliant, because you need your specific, the upgraded Luan Maris, you need the horse, the Maris. You need those pieces, you need the grade 1 to put those cards back, you would like to get the order, so this has some pretty good options to get stuff from the damage zone that'll help out. And also it has the empty rearguard circle, because it uses the skill of the Luan to put Mars into Soul, so you can then fill that out if you actually get the overtrigger to proc. Next up here we got Luard here, who kind of falls into the same vein as Bladmire, where it goes into its drag strider. Your opponent cannot use grade 1 or graders, so outside of Elementaria, they have to hard guard this or take this attack, and you can just go ahead and wipe that out and make them take the crit with the 4 drives. So pretty decent. We got ourselves PBO here, skipping over Hexorb accidentally. PBO probably likes the purple overtrigger. I would probably even argue to put it here, just because of the fact that this does retire 2, right? In order to call out Blaster Dark. It has multiple drive checks, so you can use that to extend. It might not work out the best with the Emily, depending on the attack pattern, so maybe we'll put it here. Right, so it kind of depends on the attack pattern, because typically it'll be like the promo here that attacks in, and you attack with PBO, retire the promo, which counts as 2, to call out Blaster Dark, which then gets the ability from the promo, and then you attack with Blaster Dark to pump up your Emmeline column on this side. So it might not work out if you sequence it that way, so maybe not, but maybe it can, I don't know. We'll see. Hexorb's an interesting one, because she has these huge swings that she can get with her rear guards. So typically you take those rear guard swings, because they end up being like 60, 70, 80, or you PG them, right? Whereas like Hexorb herself, if she has a booster, she can be, become a huge number. So sometimes you'll take it or you'll hard guard it. So maybe the yellow overtrigger, but I feel like she probably wants the blue overtrigger more. The purple one doesn't really work with her attack pattern because she restands her unit, so it's not really going to help her out so much. Maybe in the early game, or if she doesn't check. I think it's any trigger. I don't know if it has to be specifically crit or front. It might have to be specifically crit or front to restand. But yeah, she probably wants to stay where she's at. We got ourselves Time Stamping Dragon, who's kind of interesting because of the fact that it does bind its rear guards to call something out. But you can probably use this to extend as well, because you can have that open rear guard circle. Call something out there. This already calls out one thing, but you can bind 2 things. So it can possibly give you 5 attacks that way. Then we got ourselves here Bolformedes, who has a huge guard restrict and puts his own rear guards into soul. Right? So you can probably argue that this would like a 5th attack, but it probably would much rather the Dark States Overtrigger, honestly. But it does put stuff into soul, so it can very easily extend with this. But yeah, I think it would much rather its own Overtrigger, the Dark States Overtrigger. Then we got ourselves Chronojet. I believe Chronojet probably would benefit from this Overtrigger. You can maybe also put him here as well, just because of the fact that the next stage, right, or specifically the Chronojet, can't PG that. Your opponent has to hard guard or take it. You can wipe that out, cause them to hit anyways. Whether that's super optimal is a different story, but you could maybe make an argument for either one, so we'll just leave him in the middle. Lukier is kind of an interesting one, in that she's just a deck that I play, so I wanted to talk about it. Not so much because she actually works well with either of these Overtriggers here. Because of her attack pattern, it's typically you attack with your dragon, then Lukier, then the dragon puts itself into soul to call itself out. You don't really have a place to call it out. The, healing and getting something for damage is nice. The deck is kind of peace reliant, so that part would be kind of nice. But you'll miss out on the actual attack unless you call out like a bigger booster or something like that. Whereas like the retire doesn't really matter for her as much. Barrow is kind of interesting because you can maybe make a case for this Overtrigger. He can't really play the purple Overtrigger because of the way the timing works. Barrow attacks, then his skill activates. He puts all rear guards to soul, then he calls out 2. So after that, the drive checks happen. He won't really be able to extend and get extra attacks that way. He might be able to call something out, but you don't really want to call something out for hand from Barrow if your board, your front row circles are full like that. So that's a completely different story. Whereas, like, technically, since he board wipes, he can technically draw a bunch of cards. Whether or not that's something you want in Barrow is a completely different question. But at the same time, if it's kind of the same thing as like the other cases where sometimes you'll hard guard the Barrow Magus, PG the other attacks because they're just so big, right? From your both like lashers that can hit 60, 70, 80 sometimes. So since Barrow has the crit, sometimes that'll get BT'd also. But if it doesn't, you can blow that away and they have to take the crit. So you can kind of make an argument from it. As a Barrow player, I'll probably test it out. I don't expect much, honestly. You can choose how many cards to draw, which is nice. So if you don't have a lot of cards left in your deck, 90% of the time you won't do it. But if you do, getting extra cards in Barrow, sign me up, right? Then we got ourselves here Shotodoji and Megaloguchi here. Megaloguchi, I think, would like the purple Overtrigger just because of the sheer fact that it's similar to Magnolia. It can allow its units to attack from the back row. And the only difference here is that the Dragon Empire Overtrigger doesn't benefit him as much. He usually plays the blue one because Restand the Vanguard is great, but he doesn't really have a on-attack skill, so it's kind of whatever. It's just an extra Vanguard swing, which is also great, right? So maybe you can do something here with the purple Overtrigger. Shotodoji, he puts 2 rear guards into soul to call something from bind. He does have the promo that calls itself out from bind zone to get 5 attacks. Technically, you can use this to get a more guaranteed 5 attacks. I don't know. Eugene can retire whole board, or it can use this to retire its whole board. So might like this. I think the the Dragon Empire Overtrigger clashes with its restand, so maybe it'll like this a bit better. Buff Sagar is kind of in the same vein with these other decks where she's a huge Vanguard swing. If your opponent guards it, you can do that. You can't really use the purple one, but I'll probably put it here because she might probably want to restand because she is Dragon Empire. Roro is a funny one because it already plays the red overtrigger. Because if you check the red one, you can give it to your Momoke. Momoke can attack twice with 100 million, and then the Raylinda in the front row can then get that 100 million. So that's 300 millions, and then you call the Grape 3 from hand, that's 400 million attacks. Where now if you play the purple one, you can do something kind of funny where you can attack with Momoke, have Raylinda attack with Aurora, check purple, call a Raylinda from hand, use her skill to then get from the Momoke again, right? And then use that to overcall with the Grape 3. So, while that changes the attack pattern for the deck completely, it is something that you can do. You'll probably want to stay with the red overtrigger because that just is more consistent with your attack pattern. Then we got ourselves here Lorna Roll, who actually falls into this case here, probably up here, I think, because of the fact that she turns off Sentinels. And she has this huge 60-70k swing at your opponent with either drives or a crit, right? So your opponent might have to hard guard that. Wipe that all out, right? And go ahead and possibly draw cards, but more likely wipe it out, hit your opponent with those crits. So that kind of works out decently there. And finally, we got ourselves here Lutetia, who maybe falls into the same category. She doesn't really work out here because her attack patterns usually swing with the Vanguard twice first, and then whatever triggers go wherever they go, depending on how your opponent guarded and whatnot. So overcalling probably won't work as well with her here. Whereas, like, you know, if your opponent tries to hard guard any of the attacks, you can wipe it out. Maybe, but I think she probably just stays with whatever she has, which is probably either the blue or the lyrical one, honestly. But I could argue maybe seeing it here. I don't know. I might just put it here just to line up the tiers more nicely. But in any case, that will do it for this video. Just my quick thoughts on what decks might benefit from the new yellow / light / piss overtrigger, and then what decks might benefit from the purple / grape / dark overtrigger. In general, I think the purple one is kind of like the new go-to. Aside from decks that are more aggressive, right? They'll still stick with the blue overtrigger. Decks that are a little bit more conservative, maybe more defensive or anything like that, could use the the purple overtrigger instead. But it'll just be one of those two for the general cases, where if they don't directly benefit from another overtrigger, if you don't know what overtrigger to use, you'll use either blue or purple. So it'll just be, is your deck super aggressive and checks a lot of triggers, could use an extra crit? Play blue. Could they be more defensive? They're most piece reliant. Can you call something out from hand? Use the purple. And, you know, the red and the yellow will go into the category where it depends on whether the deck benefits directly from it or not. But in any case, let me know what you think in the comments down below. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, play Vanguard, and have yourselves a damn good one.